Deep in the misty hollows of Appalachia, where the mountains keep their secrets and the fog never quite lifts, there lived families whose very names made grown men cross themselves and children hide beneath their covers. These weren't your typical mountain clans struggling to survive in the harsh wilderness. No, these were bloodlines that had made bargains with forces older than the Cherokee legends, older than the first European settlements, older than anything decent folks should ever whisper about after dark. The winter of 1823 marked the beginning of what locals would later call the Time of Shadows. 5 families, each driven by their own desperate hunger for power, wealth, or survival, ventured into places where the boundary between our world and something far more sinister grew thin. They returned changed, carrying with them abilities that defied natural law and appetites that would haunt the Appalachian Mountains for generations to come. What you're about to discover isn't found in any history textbook. Those stories were deliberately buried, hidden away by those who understood that some knowledge is too dangerous to preserve. Federal agents sealed files, witnesses vanished without explanation, and entire communities developed an unspoken agreement to never speak of what they'd seen. But the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface, and tonight we're venturing into the darkest corners of American folklore to uncover the blood-soaked legacies of the deadliest families that ever called the mountains home. The Blackwood clan was the first to cross that invisible line between the natural and supernatural worlds. Josiah Blackwood arrived in what would later become known as Devil's Backbone Ridge in the brutal winter of 1823, fleeing accusations of witchcraft that had followed his family from Massachusetts. Unlike most settlers who sought the protection of established communities, Josiah deliberately chose the most isolated valley he could find, a place where the Cherokee had long refused to hunt and where even the animals seemed to avoid treading. The valley itself was unnatural. Trees grew in perfect circles around clearings that should have been random. Streams flowed uphill during certain phases of the moon, and the very air seemed to whisper in languages that predated human speech. Most disturbing of all was the persistent mist that never fully lifted, even on the clearest days, creating a perpetual twilight that made it impossible to judge time or direction once you ventured too deep into the hollow. Josiah's wife Martha was the first to notice the changes. Within weeks of settling in their remote cabin, she began experiencing visions during her sleep, dreams so vivid and terrifying that she would wake with physical wounds that corresponded to injuries she'd sustained in the nightmare realm. But rather than flee, the Blackwoods embraced what was happening to them. They began to understand that their new home existed at a crossroads between worlds, and they intended to exploit that position. The family's first documented supernatural encounter occurred on the winter solstice of 1823. Martha's journal, discovered decades later hidden beneath the floorboards of their abandoned cabin, described the event in chilling detail. She wrote of a presence that visited them that night, something that wore the shape of a man but cast no shadow, and spoke in voices that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. The entity offered them a bargain, power over the living and the dead, in exchange for their service as guardians of the threshold between worlds. The Blackwoods accepted without hesitation. By spring, their transformation was complete. Neighbors who ventured too close to their property reported seeing the family members moving through the perpetual mist like phantoms, their feet never quite touching the ground. More disturbing were the sounds that echoed from their hollow at night, voices speaking in unison, chanting in languages that hurt to hear, and the rhythmic pounding of what sounded like dozens of hammers striking stone, though no construction was ever visible during daylight hours. The Blackwood's supernatural abilities manifested in ways that defied rational explanation. They could predict deaths days before they occurred, appearing at the homes of the soon-to-be deceased with handmade coffins that always fit perfectly. They knew the location of lost items, missing persons, and hidden treasures, but their knowledge came with a price that few were willing to pay. Those who sought their help reported that the Blackwood's assistance always carried consequences that became apparent only after it was too late to refuse. Their most terrifying ability was what locals called the calling. When the Blackwoods wanted someone to come to their hollow, that person would begin experiencing an irresistible compulsion to walk toward Devil's Backbone Ridge, often in the middle of the night, regardless of weather conditions or personal safety. Victims described feeling as though invisible hands were guiding their steps while voices whispered directions in their ears. Most never returned. Those who did come back were forever changed, speaking in fragments about ceremonies they'd witnessed and oaths they'd been forced to swear. The family's influence spread through the surrounding counties like a plague. They never directly threatened anyone, never committed crimes that could be prosecuted in any court, but their presence poisoned the very atmosphere of the region. Livestock died for no apparent reason. Crops failed in patterns that formed symbols when viewed from high ground, and children began having shared nightmares about a place where the dead walked freely among the living. By 1830, the Blackwood clan had grown to include not just blood relatives, but dozens of converts who had been drawn into their circle through various means. Some came seeking power, others arrived after losing loved ones and hoping to communicate with the dead, and a few simply wandered into the hollow by accident and never found their way out. All of them underwent the same transformation, their humanity slowly stripped away until they became something between the living and the dead. The local Cherokee tribe, who had avoided the valley for generations, finally broke their silence about the Blackwood territory. Tribal elders spoke of an ancient evil that had slumbered beneath the mountains for centuries, waiting for someone foolish enough to wake it. They described the entity as a hunger that fed on human suffering and used the Blackwoods as its instruments to harvest that pain from the surrounding communities. The Cherokee had long ago learned to contain the evil through careful rituals and absolute avoidance of the contaminated land, but the Blackwoods had shattered those protective barriers. The family's reign of terror reached its peak during the winter of 1834, when they orchestrated what became known as the Hollows Harvest. Over the course of 3 months, 27 people from 5 different counties vanished without a trace. The disappearances followed a pattern. Each victim had recently experienced a significant loss, whether through death, financial ruin, or broken relationships. The Blackwoods had identified these vulnerable individuals and used their emotional pain as a beacon to draw them into the hollow. When spring arrived, search parties finally organized to investigate the Blackwood territory. What they found defied comprehension. The family's cabin had been expanded into a sprawling complex of interconnected buildings that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Rooms led to other rooms that couldn't possibly fit within the structure's exterior dimensions. Corridors formed impossible loops, and staircases descended far deeper into the earth than the mountain's geology should have allowed. Most disturbing were the chambers dedicated to what appeared to be religious ceremonies. The walls were covered with symbols carved directly into the wood, symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. In the center of the largest room stood an altar made from a single piece of black stone, its surface worn smooth by countless rituals. Around the altar, searchers found personal belongings from each of the 27 missing persons, arranged in patterns that suggested they had been used in some form of sympathetic magic. The Blackwoods themselves were never found. The complex was completely empty of human life, though searchers reported hearing voices, footsteps, and other sounds that suggested the presence of dozens of people just beyond the range of vision. Several members of the search party claimed to have seen figures moving through the mist that surrounded the buildings, but these phantoms vanished whenever approached directly. The authorities made the decision to burn the entire complex, hoping to purge whatever evil had taken root in the valley. The fire burned for 3 days and nights, consuming not just the buildings, but seeming to ignite the very air itself. When the flames finally died, nothing remained but a perfect circle of scorched earth where the Blackwood compound had stood. But the story didn't end there. Within months of the burning, reports began to surface of Blackwood family members appearing in communities hundreds of miles away. They looked exactly as they had before their disappearance, unchanged by the passage of time, but their presence brought with it the same atmosphere of dread and supernatural corruption that had plagued their original territory. These scattered sightings suggested that the Blackwoods had not been destroyed, but had instead dispersed, carrying their otherworldly patrons' influence to new regions. The pattern continued for decades. Communities across the eastern United States reported encounters with individuals who matched the descriptions of Blackwood family members. These encounters always preceded periods of unusual death rates, unexplained disappearances, and supernatural phenomena that local authorities struggled to explain or contain. The Blackwoods seemed to have become something more than human, agents of their dark patron who could manifest wherever conditions were right for their particular brand of spiritual corruption. The last confirmed sighting of a Blackwood family member occurred in 1967, when a woman matching Martha Blackwood's description was seen in a small town in Montana. She appeared to be exactly the same age as she had been in 1834, wearing clothes that were decades out of style and speaking in an archaic dialect that linguists couldn't identify. The woman spent 3 days in the town, visiting the local cemetery each night and leaving behind small offerings of flowers and stones arranged in complex patterns. On the 4th morning, she was gone, but her brief presence had left its mark. Over the following months, the town experienced a series of tragedies that decimated the population. Accidents, suicides, and unexplained deaths claimed nearly a third of the residents before the survivors made the collective decision to abandon the community entirely. The town remains empty to this day, its buildings slowly crumbling as nature reclaims the cursed ground. Modern researchers who have attempted to investigate the Blackwood phenomenon have encountered significant obstacles. Records relating to the family have a tendency to disappear from archives. Witnesses become reluctant to speak about their experiences, and electronic equipment frequently malfunctions when used to document evidence. Those who persist in their investigations often report experiencing the same compulsions that once drew victims to Devil's Backbone Ridge, suggesting that the Blackwood's influence continues to operate across time and space. The original valley where the Blackwood saga began remains uninhabited and largely unexplored. Satellite imagery shows an area of permanent shadow that obscures ground-level details, and GPS systems consistently malfunction when used to navigate the region. The few hikers who have attempted to explore the valley report becoming hopelessly lost within minutes of entering the tree line, wandering in circles for hours before finally emerging at the same point where they entered. Local folklore suggests that the Blackwoods are still active in their ancestral territory, maintaining whatever unholy compact they forged with the entity that dwells beneath the mountains. Residents of the surrounding counties speak of lights that move through the mist on moonless nights, of voices that call out names of people who died decades ago, and of a persistent feeling that something ancient and hungry is always watching from the shadows. The Blackwood legacy serves as a chilling reminder that some bargains extract a price that extends far beyond the individuals who make them. Their story demonstrates how the pursuit of power, even when driven by desperation or grief, can unleash forces that corrupt not just the seekers themselves, but entire communities and regions. The Blackwoods were just the beginning. While their dark legacy still haunts the eastern ridges, deeper in the Appalachian wilderness, other bloodlines were forging their own terrible bargains with forces that predate human understanding. These weren't families driven by desperation or circumstance. These were clans that actively sought out the darkness, that welcomed it into their bloodlines, and that built their entire existence around serving entities that should never have been awakened. In the winter of 1847, as snow blocked the mountain passes and isolated entire valleys for months, 3 separate families made contact with something ancient, something that had been waiting in the deep places of the earth, patient as stone, hungry as flame. What emerged from those encounters would terrorize the region for generations, creating bloodlines so twisted that their very existence challenged the natural order itself. The Mordecai clan arrived in the Cumberland Gap, fleeing accusations of grave robbing in Pennsylvania. Ezra Mordecai, a former medical student expelled for conducting unauthorized experiments on cadavers, had heard whispers of opportunities in the isolated mountain communities. Places where a man with certain skills could practice his craft without interference from authorities or moral constraints. What he discovered in those mist-shrouded hollows was far more than he had bargained for. The family settled in a narrow valley locals called Bone Hollow, a place where the limestone caves ran so deep that thrown stones never seemed to hit bottom. The soil was unusually rich, almost black, and plants grew with an unnatural vigor that both impressed and unsettled neighboring farmers. Within their first winter, the Mordecais made a discovery that would define their bloodline for generations to come. While exploring the extensive cave system beneath their property, Ezra discovered a chamber filled with what appeared to be perfectly preserved human remains. Not ancient bones, but bodies that looked as though they had died recently, arranged in careful patterns around a central altar carved from a single piece of obsidian. The preservation was impossible given the cave's humidity and temperature, yet the flesh remained supple, the features intact, as though death had only recently claimed them. As Ezra examined the bodies more closely, he realized they weren't random corpses, but representatives of different time periods. Clothing styles, dental work, even the preservation techniques varied across decades, possibly centuries. Someone or something had been collecting these specimens for far longer than European settlement in the region. At the chamber's center, the obsidian altar bore inscriptions in a script that resembled no known language, yet somehow conveyed meaning directly to the mind of anyone who looked upon it. The message was simple. Death is not the end, but a transition, and those who understood this truth could command both the living and the dead. The altar required offerings, fresh specimens to add to the collection, and in exchange, it would grant knowledge of the flesh, mastery over decay and regeneration, and the ability to speak with those who had crossed beyond the veil. Ezra's first offering was a drifter who had sought shelter during a blizzard. The man's body joined the collection, perfectly preserved, and Ezra found himself possessed of medical knowledge that surpassed anything taught in universities. He could diagnose ailments with supernatural accuracy, perform surgeries that should have been impossible with the crude tools available, and most remarkably, he could communicate with his patients after they died. The Mordecai family practice became renowned throughout the region. Ezra's treatments were miraculous, his surgical skills legendary, and his ability to ease the suffering of the dying was considered almost divine. Families traveled for weeks to seek his help, and few left disappointed. What they didn't know was that every patient who died under his care became part of his collection, their bodies spirited away to the chamber beneath Bone Hollow, their voices joining the chorus of the dead that whispered secrets to the living. The practice passed to Ezra's children, each generation expanding the collection, refining the techniques, and deepening their connection to the realm beyond death. They developed methods of preserving consciousness within deceased tissue, creating what they called the eternal patients. These preserved dead could be consulted for medical knowledge, historical information, or simply to satisfy the curiosity of the living who wished to speak with departed loved ones. By the 1890s, the Mordecai family operated what appeared to be a modest medical practice, but was actually a necromantic consultation service. Wealthy clients from as far away as New York would make the treacherous journey to Bone Hollow, paying enormous sums to speak with deceased relatives or to receive medical treatment that bordered on resurrection. The family grew wealthy and influential, their medical miracles earning them protection from local authorities and the gratitude of powerful families. The cost of this supernatural practice became apparent in the family's physical transformation. Each generation of Mordecai's grew paler, their eyes taking on a milky quality that suggested partial blindness, yet seemed to see more than normal vision allowed. Their skin became translucent, veins visible beneath the surface, and they moved with the deliberate care of those who understood the fragility of the boundary between life and death. More disturbing was their relationship with mortality itself. Mordecai family members didn't age in the traditional sense, but underwent a gradual transformation that made them appear increasingly corpse-like while retaining full vitality. They required less food, less sleep, and seemed immune to most diseases, but their presence made others profoundly uncomfortable. Children would cry in their vicinity, animals would refuse to approach them, and even their patients, despite benefiting from their treatments, would leave their encounters feeling deeply unsettled. The family's practices continued uninterrupted until 1923, when a federal investigation into missing persons reports led authorities to Bone Hollow. The official report, heavily redacted and sealed for 50 years, described the discovery of the underground chamber and its impossible contents. Federal agents found over 200 perfectly preserved bodies arranged in the ritual chamber, including several individuals who had been reported missing in recent years. The Mordecai family vanished before the raid, leaving behind only their medical practice and a collection of journals written in the same mysterious script found on the obsidian altar. Linguists and cryptographers have never successfully translated these texts, though those who spend too much time studying them report persistent nightmares and an overwhelming urge to visit cemeteries at night. The chamber was sealed with concrete and steel, but local residents report that the sealing was ineffective. Construction workers involved in the project experienced unusually high rates of accidents and illness, and several died under mysterious circumstances. The concrete itself developed cracks within months, and strange sounds began emanating from the sealed chamber during the dark of the moon. Recent investigations have revealed that the Mordecai bloodline continues, though their practice has evolved with the times. Modern descendants work as morticians, medical examiners, and forensic specialists, positions that provide them with access to the recently deceased. They maintain the ancient compact through more subtle means, and their supernatural abilities have adapted to contemporary needs. Funeral homes operated by Mordecai descendants report unusually high rates of families claiming to have received messages from their deceased loved ones. Medical examiners in their employ demonstrate uncanny abilities to determine cause of death in even the most complex cases. Most disturbing, several cold cases have been solved through anonymous tips that contained information only the deceased could have known. The obsidian altar remains in its sealed chamber, though monitoring equipment placed nearby frequently malfunctions. Seismic readings indicate ongoing activity in the chamber, subtle vibrations that occur in patterns too regular to be natural. Local geological surveys have been unable to explain the phenomenon, and requests to excavate the site have been repeatedly denied by federal authorities. In the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas, the Thorn family established their dynasty through a different but equally disturbing relationship with supernatural forces. Unlike the Mordecais, who sought to preserve the dead, the Thorns were obsessed with controlling the living through manipulation of human desire and addiction. Jacob Thorn arrived in the region in 1851, a former pharmacist who had been expelled from his profession for conducting unauthorized experiments with psychoactive substances. He brought with him an extensive knowledge of chemistry and botany, along with a collection of rare plants and minerals that he claimed could alter human consciousness in profound ways. The Thorn settlement was established in a remote valley where unusual plants grew wild, species that botanists couldn't classify, and that seemed to possess properties unknown to conventional science. The soil itself was strange, containing mineral deposits that glowed faintly in darkness and seemed to pulse with an inner rhythm. Jacob recognized these phenomena as signs of something extraordinary and began his experiments immediately. Working with the native plants and the mysterious mineral deposits, Jacob developed a series of compounds that could induce specific emotional and psychological states. His early experiments were conducted on willing volunteers, local residents who suffered from various ailments and were desperate for relief. The results were remarkable. Chronic pain vanished, depression lifted, and even severe mental illness seemed to respond to his treatments. Word of Jacob's miraculous cures spread throughout the region, attracting patients from hundreds of miles away. His treatments were indeed effective, but they came with a hidden cost. The compounds he created were highly addictive, and patients who stopped taking them experienced withdrawal symptoms far worse than their original conditions. More troubling, the substances seemed to create a psychological dependence that went beyond mere chemical addiction. Patients who had been treated by Jacob reported feeling compelled to return to his valley, describing vivid dreams that called them back to the Thorn settlement. They spoke of hearing Jacob's voice in their minds, guiding their thoughts and influencing their decisions even when they were hundreds of miles away. Families began noticing personality changes in their loved ones who had received Thorn treatments, subtle alterations that made them seem like different people entirely. The truth was far more sinister than anyone suspected. Jacob's compounds weren't just treating symptoms, they were creating a form of chemical telepathy that allowed him to influence the thoughts and emotions of anyone who had consumed his preparations. The mineral deposits in the valley contained elements that existed in a state of quantum entanglement with similar compounds in the human brain, creating a network of consciousness that Jacob could access and manipulate. As his influence grew, Jacob began using his network of psychically connected patients to gather information and exert control over the region's economic and political structures. Business decisions were influenced by subtle suggestions planted in the minds of key individuals. Political elections were swayed by mass psychological manipulation of voters who had been exposed to Thorn compounds. The family that accumulated wealth and power through what amounted to supernatural mind control on a massive scale. The Thorn children inherited their father's abilities, but each generation's powers grew stronger and more sophisticated. They developed new compounds that could induce specific behaviors, alter memories, and even implant false experiences that felt completely real to the subjects. Their influence spread beyond the Ozark region, reaching into major cities where their agents distributed specially prepared substances through seemingly legitimate pharmaceutical companies. By the early 1900s, the Thorn family operated a shadow empire based on chemical mind control. They had agents in government, business, and academia, all unknowingly serving the family's interests through subtle psychological manipulation. Their compounds were distributed through patent medicines, tonics, and even food products, creating a vast network of individuals whose thoughts and actions could be influenced from the remote valley where it all began. The family's control techniques became increasingly sophisticated as they incorporated advances in chemistry and psychology. They developed substances that could be absorbed through skin contact, inhaled through the air, or even transmitted through sound waves that carried molecular information. Their victims often had no idea they had been exposed, attributing their changed thoughts and behaviors to natural evolution of their own minds. The Thorn empire began to crumble during the 1960s when federal drug enforcement efforts accidentally uncovered part of their operation. Investigators pursuing illegal LSD distribution stumbled upon laboratories producing compounds that didn't match any known psychoactive substances. Chemical analysis revealed molecular structures that seemed to violate basic principles of organic chemistry, containing elements that shouldn't have been stable under normal conditions. The family once again vanished before authorities could apprehend them, but their influence persisted through the thousands of individuals who remained connected to their psychic network. These unwitting agents continued to serve Thorn interests, though they believed their actions were motivated by their own desires and decisions. The network remained active, operating without central coordination, but still following patterns established by generations of conditioning. Modern investigations have revealed that the Thorn bloodline continues to operate, though their methods have evolved to take advantage of contemporary technology. They have connections to pharmaceutical companies, social media platforms, and even food manufacturers, using these channels to distribute their influence-enhancing compounds to massive populations. Their modern preparations are far more subtle than their historical counterparts, designed to enhance existing psychological tendencies rather than create obvious behavioral changes. The most disturbing recent development is the discovery that Thorn compounds can be transmitted through digital media. Specific combinations of light frequencies, sound waves, and even electromagnetic fields can carry molecular information that affects brain chemistry in viewers or listeners. Social media posts, streaming videos, and even smartphone apps have been found to contain these transmission methods, creating a form of mass influence that operates through the very technology people use daily. In the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, the Ashford family forged their dark legacy through communion with entities that existed in the spaces between dimensions. Their story begins in 1859 when Cornelius Ashford, a former seminary student who had been expelled for studying forbidden texts, discovered a series of natural caves that seemed to exist in multiple realities simultaneously. The Ashford Caves were a geological impossibility, chambers that appeared different sizes depending on the observer's perspective, and passages that led to locations that shouldn't have been accessible given the mountain's topography. Most disturbing were the sounds that emanated from the deepest chambers, voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization, offering knowledge and power to those brave enough to listen. Cornelius spent months mapping the cave system, documenting phenomena that challenged his understanding of reality itself. Rooms that were empty during the day would be filled with furniture at night. Passages that led upward somehow descended into depths that extended far below the mountain's base. Most remarkably, the caves seemed to respond to human presence, changing their configuration to accommodate visitors and revealing new chambers to those who demonstrated proper respect for the entities that dwelled within. The beings that inhabited these interdimensional spaces were unlike anything in terrestrial experience. They existed partially in our reality and partially in realms that operated under different physical laws. Communication with them required a fundamental alteration of human consciousness, a process that Cornelius achieved through meditation techniques borrowed from various occult traditions and modified to account for the unique properties of the caves. The entities offered Cornelius knowledge of reality's hidden structure, revealing that what humans perceived as solid matter was actually a thin membrane separating countless parallel dimensions. They taught him techniques for piercing this membrane, allowing limited travel between realities and access to resources that existed in alternate versions of the world. In exchange, they required specific services that would help them extend their influence into the human dimension. The Ashford family became interdimensional merchants, trading resources and information between parallel realities. They could obtain objects that didn't exist in our world, access knowledge from alternate histories, and even recruit assistance from versions of themselves that had made different life choices. Their wealth and influence grew rapidly as they cornered markets in impossible goods and provided services that no competitors could match. Each generation of Ashfords developed stronger connections to the interdimensional realm, their consciousness becoming increasingly fluid and capable of existing in multiple realities simultaneously. They could be present in several locations at once, access memories from alternate versions of their lives, and perceive events across different dimensional planes. This expansion of consciousness came at the cost of their connection to baseline human reality, making them increasingly alien to normal human experience. The family's interdimensional activities had profound effects on the local region. The boundaries between realities became thinner around their mountain stronghold, causing spontaneous manifestations of objects and creatures from parallel dimensions. Locals reported seeing buildings that appeared overnight and vanished by morning, encountering people who claimed to be from nearby towns that didn't exist, and experiencing time distortions where minutes stretched into hours or entire days passed in moments. The Ashford influence extended beyond their immediate territory through their network of interdimensional contacts. They maintained relationships with alternate versions of historical figures, accessing knowledge and resources from timelines where different decisions had been made. This allowed them to manipulate events in their own reality with unprecedented precision, knowing the outcomes of various choices because they had observed the results in parallel dimensions. The family's practices continued successfully until the 1970s, when their interdimensional activities began attracting unwanted attention from entities that existed in the spaces between realities. These beings, far more powerful and malevolent than the Ashfords' original contacts, viewed the family's activities as violations of interdimensional law and began taking steps to eliminate them. The conflict that followed was unlike anything in recorded history, a war fought across multiple dimensions simultaneously. Reality itself became unstable in the Ashford territory, with entire sections of the mountain flickering between different versions of existence. Witnesses reported seeing the same events occur with different outcomes, encountering multiple versions of the same people, and experiencing memories of events that had never happened in their own timeline. The Ashford family's fate remains unclear, as different versions of events occurred simultaneously across parallel dimensions. In some realities, they were completely destroyed by the interdimensional entities. In others, they successfully negotiated a truce and continue their practices on a smaller scale. In still others, they evolved beyond physical existence entirely, becoming interdimensional beings themselves. What is certain is that their mountain stronghold remains a nexus of interdimensional activity. The caves continue to shift and change, revealing new chambers and passages to those who know how to navigate them. Government monitoring stations placed around the area frequently record readings that violate known laws of physics, and personnel assigned to these facilities report experiences that suggest reality itself remains unstable in the region. The Ashford legacy persists through their influence on the fundamental structure of reality in their territory. The boundaries between dimensions remain permanently weakened, allowing spontaneous manifestations of alternate realities to occur. These phenomena have attracted the attention of various government agencies and academic institutions, though official investigations are consistently hampered by the unpredictable nature of interdimensional effects. These three bloodlines represent the darkest evolution of Appalachian folk magic, families that didn't just bargain with supernatural forces, but became supernatural themselves. Their legacies continue to influence the region, creating zones of altered reality where the normal rules of existence don't apply. The shadows between Kentucky and Tennessee hold secrets that most folks would rather forget. Deep in the hollows where the mist clings to mountain laurel and the old ways never truly died, three families carried on traditions that made even the most hardened locals cross themselves and look away. We're talking about bloodlines that understood something fundamental about these ancient peaks, something that goes beyond simple mountain witchcraft or folk medicine. These families knew that the mountains themselves were alive, breathing, waiting, and hungry for the right kind of offering. What you're about to discover isn't just another collection of backwoods folklore. The evidence scattered across county records, medical examiner files, and testimonies from those brave enough to speak reveals practices so disturbing that federal investigators quietly closed their cases and sealed the documents. We're diving into territories where the normal rules of human behavior broke down completely, where entire communities lived in terror of three family names that are still whispered like curses in certain parts of Appalachia. The Rawlings family of Devil's Backbone Ridge understood that fear was currency, and they traded in it for over a century. The Grimm clan perfected the art of psychological warfare, turning their victims' own minds against them before moving in for the kill. And the Slaughter family, well, their name wasn't chosen by accident. They believed that certain kinds of death could feed the mountain spirits that protected their territory, and they were willing to provide that nourishment regularly. These weren't just isolated incidents of mountain justice gone wrong. These were systematic operations that combined ancient Appalachian folk magic with calculated brutality, creating legacies of terror that stretched across generations. Local law enforcement learned to avoid certain areas entirely, and federal agents who ventured too deep into these family territories often found themselves transferred to other assignments, if they were lucky enough to make it out at all. The most disturbing part isn't just what these families did, but how they managed to operate for so long with virtual impunity. They understood something about the psychology of fear that allowed them to control entire communities through reputation alone. People would abandon their homes, their livelihoods, their ancestral lands, rather than risk crossing paths with these clans. And for those who couldn't leave, silence became a survival strategy passed down through generations. The Rawlings family established their reign of terror on Devil's Backbone Ridge in 1889, arriving from the deeper mountains of Virginia after what local records describe only as an incident involving a traveling preacher who was found crucified to a giant oak tree. Ezra Rawlings, the family patriarch, was a man of unusual intelligence who understood that true power came not from violence alone, but from the fear of violence applied with surgical precision. The Rawlings never killed randomly. Every death, every disappearance, every act of brutality served a specific purpose in maintaining their psychological dominance over the surrounding communities. They developed what amounted to a system of terror taxation, where local families would leave offerings at specific locations throughout the mountains, tribute payments that bought safety for another season. What made the Rawlings particularly effective was their understanding of human psychology. They studied their victims carefully, learning their fears, their weaknesses, their most cherished relationships. When someone crossed them or failed to pay their tribute, the punishment was always personally tailored to inflict maximum psychological damage. A man who loved his livestock might find his prize bull skinned alive and displayed in his pasture. A woman who doted on her children might discover one of them missing for just long enough to drive her to madness before the child was returned, forever changed by whatever they had experienced. The family maintained detailed records of every person in their territory, keeping track of debts, relationships, and psychological profiles in a series of leather-bound journals that they called their Books of Understanding. These journals, written in a mixture of English and symbols that appeared to be their own creation, contained not just information about their victims, but detailed plans for psychological manipulation that could span years. Their most notorious technique was something they called the slow harvest. Rather than simply killing their enemies, they would systematically destroy everything that person valued over the course of months or even years. Crops would fail mysteriously, livestock would sicken and die, children would suffer accidents that left them permanently damaged, and family members would begin turning against each other as paranoia and suspicion ate away at their relationships. The Rawlings compound itself was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Built into the side of Devil's Backbone Ridge, the main house was constructed with deliberate architectural elements designed to unsettle visitors. Hallways that seemed to lead nowhere, rooms with no apparent purpose, and windows that looked out onto carefully arranged displays of animal bones and rusted farm equipment. The most disturbing feature was the front porch, where the family would sit in rocking chairs every evening at sunset, watching the valleys below with telescopes and making notes in their journals about the activities of their subjects. Local children were taught from an early age never to venture onto Devil's Backbone Ridge and never to look directly at the Rawlings house if they could see it from a distance. Parents would tell stories of children who had stared too long at the compound and had been found days later, alive but fundamentally changed, speaking in whispers about things they claimed to have seen that made no sense to adult ears. The family's influence extended far beyond their immediate territory through a network of informants and collaborators that included shopkeepers, postal workers, and even members of local law enforcement. They had perfected the art of identifying individuals who could be bought, blackmailed, or simply terrified into cooperation. This network allowed them to know about any planned actions against them long before they materialized, and to strike preemptively against potential threats. Their reign of terror continued uninterrupted until 1934, when a group of federal agents investigating moonshine operations in the region began asking too many questions about the Rawlings family. 3 agents disappeared while conducting surveillance of the compound, and their bodies were never found. However, their equipment was discovered arranged in a perfect circle around a large oak tree, along with a note written in the same symbolic language found in the Rawlings journals. The federal response was swift and decisive. A military unit was deployed to Devil's Backbone Ridge under the cover of a training exercise, and the Rawlings compound was destroyed in what official records describe as a controlled demolition to remove unstable structures. No members of the Rawlings family were ever seen again, though locals reported seeing lights moving through the ruins of the compound for months afterward. The Grimm clan operated from a different philosophy entirely. Where the Rawlings relied on fear and psychological manipulation, the Grimms understood that the most effective way to control people was to make them complicit in their own destruction. They established their base of operations in the Twisted Creek Valley of eastern Kentucky in 1902, and within a decade had created what amounted to a cult of personality that drew desperate people from across the region. Marcus Grimm, the family's leader, was a charismatic figure who combined the fervor of a revival preacher with the cunning of a confidence man. He preached a twisted version of mountain Christianity that emphasized personal sacrifice and the purification of the soul through suffering. His followers, drawn primarily from the poorest and most desperate families in the region, were willing to endure almost any hardship if it meant securing their place in what Grimm promised would be a new spiritual kingdom. The Grimm compound was designed to reinforce their leader's message of sacrifice and purification. The main buildings were constructed entirely from materials that followers were required to gather and prepare themselves, often under dangerous conditions. The centerpiece was a massive wooden structure that served as both church and courthouse, where Marcus Grimm would preside over ceremonies that combined elements of religious service with judicial proceedings. New followers were required to undergo a process called the unburdening, where they would confess not just their sins, but their deepest fears, shames, and secrets to Marcus Grimm in front of the entire community. This information was carefully recorded and used to maintain psychological control over the followers, who knew that any attempt to leave the community would result in their most humiliating secrets being revealed to the outside world. The Grimm family's true genius lay in their understanding of how to make people destroy themselves. Rather than simply killing their enemies, they would manipulate situations so that their victims would make increasingly desperate choices that ultimately led to their own downfall. A man who owed them money might be offered a chance to work off his debt by bringing in new followers, only to discover that his recruitment methods had made him complicit in activities that would destroy his reputation if revealed. Their most effective technique was something they called the devil's bargain. When someone came to them seeking help, whether for financial problems, family troubles, or health issues, the Grimms would offer a solution that seemed reasonable on the surface, but contained hidden costs that would only become apparent over time. A farmer whose crops were failing might be given seeds that would produce an exceptional harvest, but would also make his land dependent on continued treatments that only the Grimms could provide. The psychological manipulation extended to their treatment of children within the community. Young people were separated from their families and raised collectively, with their education focusing on absolute loyalty to the Grimm family and the belief that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous. These children were taught to spy on their own parents and to report any signs of disloyalty or doubt. The Grimm family maintained their control through a combination of religious fervor, economic dependence, and psychological manipulation that made their followers genuinely believe that they were part of something sacred and important. Even when presented with evidence of the family's criminal activities, most followers would rationalize or deny what they had seen, unable to accept that they had been deceived. Their operation began to unravel in 1938 when a young woman named Sarah Mitchell escaped from the compound and made her way to the nearest town. Her testimony to local authorities revealed a community where children were being systematically abused, where followers were being worked to death in illegal mining operations, and where those who questioned the leadership simply disappeared. The subsequent investigation revealed that the Grimm family had been operating what amounted to a slave labor camp, using their followers to extract coal and timber from their extensive land holdings. The profits from these operations were being used to purchase additional property and to bribe local officials who might have otherwise interfered with their activities. When state police finally raided the compound, they found it nearly empty. Most of the followers had been evacuated days earlier, and the Grimm family had vanished completely. The only evidence of their activities was a series of underground chambers where followers had been housed in conditions that investigators described as worse than prison cells. The Slaughter family earned their reputation through methods that were more direct, but no less terrifying than their contemporaries. Operating from their stronghold in the remote Bloodroot Hollow of Tennessee, they believed that the mountain spirits that protected their territory required regular offerings of human life, and they were willing to provide those offerings with ritualistic precision. Jacob Slaughter, the family patriarch, was a former Union soldier who had become convinced during the Civil War that he possessed a supernatural ability to sense impending death. He claimed that this gift had kept him alive through numerous battles, and that it had been granted to him by ancient spirits that dwelled in the Appalachian Mountains. When he established his family's homestead in Bloodroot Hollow in 1874, he began developing a system of ritualistic practices designed to honor these spirits and maintain their protection. The Slaughter family's approach to violence was methodical and ceremonial. They maintained a detailed calendar based on lunar cycles and seasonal changes, with specific dates designated for different types of offerings. The family believed that the spirits required variety in their sacrifices, and they developed elaborate rituals for different categories of victims. Their most disturbing practice was something they called the choosing. Once each season, family members would venture out from Bloodroot Hollow to identify suitable offerings for their rituals. The selection process was based on criteria that seemed to combine practical considerations with spiritual beliefs. They preferred victims who would not be immediately missed, but they also believed that certain types of people carried spiritual energy that was particularly nourishing to the mountain spirits. The actual killings were performed according to strict ritualistic guidelines that had been passed down through the family for generations. Each ceremony took place at a stone altar that the family had constructed in a natural amphitheater deep in the hollow. The victims were always conscious during the ritual, as the family believed that the fear and pain experienced during the sacrifice was an essential component of the spiritual offering. The Slaughter family maintained detailed records of their sacrificial practices, including descriptions of the rituals, the reactions of the victims, and any supernatural phenomena that they believed had resulted from their offerings. These records, written in a mixture of English and what appeared to be Cherokee symbols, revealed a family that was genuinely convinced they were performing a sacred duty. Their territory was marked by a series of warning signs that became increasingly elaborate over the years. Wooden poles topped with human skulls marked the boundaries of their land, and travelers who ventured too close to these markers often found their paths blocked by arrangements of bones and other human remains. The family believed that these displays would deter casual intruders while attracting the type of desperate individuals who might be suitable for their rituals. The Slaughter family's activities were finally exposed in 1931 when a group of federal agents investigating bootlegging operations in the region discovered their ritual site. The stone altar was surrounded by the remains of dozens of victims, some recent and others that had been there for years. The scene was so disturbing that several of the investigators required medical treatment for psychological trauma. The subsequent manhunt for the Slaughter family involved multiple law enforcement agencies and lasted for nearly 2 years. The family's knowledge of the mountain terrain and their network of hidden caves and shelters made them nearly impossible to track. When they were finally cornered in a remote canyon, they chose to fight rather than surrender, resulting in a gun battle that left all known members of the family dead. However, the investigation revealed that the Slaughter family's influence had extended far beyond their immediate territory. They had been trading victims with other criminal families throughout the region, and their ritualistic practices had inspired copycat activities in several other communities. The full extent of their network was never completely understood, as many of the records they had maintained were destroyed in the fire that consumed their compound. These three families represent the darkest evolution of Appalachian folk traditions, where ancient beliefs about the supernatural power of the mountains were twisted into justifications for systematic brutality. Their legacies continue to influence the region today, with certain areas still avoided by locals who remember the stories passed down through their families. The psychological techniques they developed, their understanding of how fear could be used as a tool of control, and their ability to operate for decades without significant interference from law enforcement reveal uncomfortable truths about how isolated communities can become breeding grounds for systematic abuse. But what happens when families don't just trade with supernatural forces, but actually become conduits for interdimensional beings seeking permanent residence in our world? In the deepest hollers of Appalachian territory, where morning mist never fully burns off and compasses spin wildly without reason, three bloodlines discovered that some bargains don't end with a single generation. They become hereditary contracts, passed down through DNA itself, binding entire family trees to serve as anchors for entities that exist between worlds. The Kesler family of Bone Creek Valley learned this truth in the most horrifying way possible. What started as a desperate plea for survival in 1847 evolved into something far more sinister, a multi-generational hosting arrangement that transformed their descendants into living doorways. Each Kesler child born after that first winter carried something extra in their blood, something that waited patiently for the right moment to emerge. Martha Kesler arrived in the valley pregnant and widowed, fleeing the Irish potato famine with nothing but the clothes on her back and a fierce determination to survive. The winter of 1847 proved especially brutal, with snowfall that buried cabins to their rooftops and temperatures that killed livestock where they stood. By February, Martha's food stores had dwindled to nothing, and her unborn child had stopped moving in her womb. Desperate beyond reason, Martha ventured into the deepest part of the valley, where local Cherokee had warned her never to go. The trees there grew in impossible spirals, their bark bearing patterns that hurt to look at directly. At the valley's heart, she found a natural stone circle filled with perfectly still water that reflected no light whatsoever. The surface remained liquid despite the freezing temperatures, and when Martha knelt beside it, she could see shapes moving in the depths, shadows that swam against the current of reality itself. "My baby," she whispered to the dark water. The response came not as words, but as understanding, flowing directly into her consciousness. The entities beneath the water were refugees from a dying dimension, seeking new hosts in a world where the barriers between realities had grown thin. They offered Martha a trade. Her child would live, but it would serve as a bridge between worlds, allowing these beings to experience physical existence through human flesh. Martha's acceptance sealed a contract that would span generations. Her son Thomas was born healthy and strong, but with eyes that occasionally reflected light, like an animal's, and a habit of speaking in languages that predated human civilization. As he grew, neighbors noticed that Thomas seemed to know things he shouldn't, predicting weather changes days in advance and finding lost objects with uncanny accuracy. The true nature of the Kesler condition became apparent when Thomas reached adolescence. During the full moon closest to his 16th birthday, his personality began to shift. Family members reported that Thomas would sometimes speak in entirely different voices, displaying knowledge of events that had occurred centuries before his birth. More disturbing, he began to demonstrate abilities that defied natural law, healing severe injuries with a touch, starting fires with concentrated stare, and most unnervingly, stepping partially out of physical reality, becoming translucent for hours at a time. The pattern repeated with each generation. Every Kesler descendant carried the interdimensional contract in their blood, becoming hosts for the entities that had first contacted Martha. But the beings grew stronger with each passing decade, their influence more pronounced in each new host. By the 1920s, Kesler children were being born with physical anomalies that clearly marked them as something other than entirely human. Local records from the period describe Kesler newborns with unusual bone structures, extra joints in their fingers, and most disturbingly, the ability to survive for extended periods without breathing. Medical professionals who examined these children reported that their internal anatomy differed significantly from normal human physiology, with additional organs whose function remained mysterious. The hosting process typically began during adolescence, when the interdimensional entities would gradually assume greater control over their human vessels. Family members described the transformation as a slow dissolution of the original personality, replaced by something ancient and alien. The possessed Keslers retained their memories and basic human behaviors, but their motivations and goals became incomprehensible to ordinary people. During the 1930s, the Kesler family established what they called the Convergence House, a sprawling structure built according to architectural principles that seemed to violate basic geometry. The building contained rooms that were larger inside than outside, hallways that led to different destinations depending on the time of day, and windows that showed landscapes that existed in no earthly location. The Convergence House served as a gathering place for the entities inhabiting various Kesler family members, allowing them to coordinate their activities across multiple hosts. Visitors to the house reported experiencing severe disorientation, with many losing track of time entirely. Some claimed to have spent days inside the building, only to emerge and discover that mere hours had passed in the outside world. The most disturbing aspect of the Kesler operation was their recruitment efforts. The possessed family members began identifying other individuals with genetic markers that made them suitable hosts for additional interdimensional refugees. These potential hosts were approached through seemingly chance encounters, gradually introduced to the family through social connections, and eventually invited to the Convergence House for what they believed were ordinary social gatherings. Once inside the house, visitors would be exposed to various forms of interdimensional radiation that weakened the barriers between their consciousness and the alien entities seeking new hosts. The process was subtle and gradual, often taking months or even years to complete. Victims would slowly lose aspects of their original personality, replaced by the alien intelligence that had claimed them. By the 1950s, the Kesler influence had spread throughout the region, with dozens of families unknowingly hosting interdimensional entities. These possessed individuals maintained their normal lives and relationships while serving the alien agenda of preparing Earth for a larger invasion. They established businesses, entered politics, and even joined law enforcement, creating a network of influence that protected their activities from outside scrutiny. The Kesler legacy reached its most dangerous phase during the 1970s, when the accumulated interdimensional energy in the region began to tear permanent rifts in reality. These tears, invisible to normal human perception, allowed the entities to bring through increasingly large portions of their dying dimension. The local environment began to change in subtle but measurable ways. Gravity fluctuations, time distortions, and the appearance of plant and animal life that couldn't be classified by traditional biology. Federal authorities became aware of the situation when satellite imagery revealed anomalous readings from the valley. A joint task force combining military personnel, scientists, and specialists in paranormal phenomena was assembled to investigate. What they discovered challenged their understanding of reality itself. The investigation team found that the Kesler property existed in a state of dimensional flux, with portions of the convergence house extending into parallel realities. The possessed family members had been using their human forms to anchor increasingly large sections of the alien dimension to our world, creating a bridgehead for a full-scale interdimensional colonization. The government response was swift and decisive. The entire valley was evacuated under the cover of a chemical spill, and the convergence house was destroyed using experimental weapons designed to disrupt dimensional barriers. The possessed Kesler family members were captured and held in specialized containment facilities, though reports suggest that several escaped during the chaos. However, the interdimensional contamination had already spread beyond the valley. The entities that had used the Kesler family as hosts had established secondary anchor points throughout the region, creating a network of dimensional weak spots that continued to allow alien influence to seep into our reality. Government monitoring stations, disguised as weather research facilities, were established at these locations to track and contain any further interdimensional activity. The Kesler bloodline officially ended with the government raids, but the genetic markers that made them suitable hosts continue to appear in the regional population. Children born with these markers are quietly monitored and, when necessary, relocated to areas where they can be properly supervised. The interdimensional refugees remain trapped in our reality, cut off from their home dimension, but still seeking new hosts to continue their existence. Modern residents of the former Kesler territory report ongoing anomalies: electronics that malfunction in specific patterns, wildlife that displays impossible behaviors, and a persistent feeling of being watched by invisible observers. The valley where the Convergence House once stood remains uninhabitable, surrounded by federal warnings about environmental contamination that will supposedly last for centuries. The true horror of the Kesler legacy lies not in what they accomplished, but in what they made possible. The dimensional barriers in the region remain weakened, creating opportunities for other interdimensional entities to establish footholds in our reality. The precedent set by Martha Kesler's desperate bargain continues to echo through the generations, a reminder that some forms of help come with consequences that extend far beyond the original recipient. Government files on the Kesler case remain classified, but leaked documents suggest that similar interdimensional intrusions have been detected in other remote regions worldwide. The entities that once inhabited the Kesler family may have been refugees from a dying dimension, but they were also scouts, preparing the way for something far more comprehensive and terrifying. The mountain valleys of Appalachia continue to hide secrets that challenge human understanding of reality itself. In the deepest hollows, where cell towers cannot reach and GPS signals fail, the boundaries between worlds remain thin. The Kesler family may be gone, but their legacy persists in the form of dimensional scars that may never fully heal, permanent reminders of the price paid for survival in the unforgiving mountain wilderness. Those who study such matters whisper that the Kesler case represents only the beginning of a much larger phenomenon. As our world grows more connected and technology advances, the barriers between dimensions continue to weaken. The winter solstice of 1889 brought more than just bitter cold to the Appalachian highlands. It brought visitors. Federal investigators arrived in McDowell County following reports of entire families vanishing from their homesteads, leaving behind only empty cabins and livestock found dead in perfect geometric patterns. What they discovered would challenge everything they thought they knew about the isolated mountain communities that had thrived beyond the reach of civilization. The investigation files, sealed for over a century, revealed a chilling truth. The families we've discussed weren't just practitioners of dark arts or victims of supernatural bargains. They were part of something far more systematic, far more terrifying. The Mordecai family, with their necromantic practices, weren't just raising the dead for personal gain. They were maintaining communication channels between the living and entities that existed beyond death. The Thorn family's interdimensional gateways weren't random experiments, but carefully positioned access points that allowed something to monitor and influence events across multiple realities simultaneously. The Ashford family's mind control abilities weren't used merely for local dominance, but to create sleeper agents who could influence politics, business, and law enforcement far beyond the mountains. Each family's curse, each bargain, each ritual served a greater purpose that government investigators could barely comprehend. The documents describe a hierarchy of influence that extended from the deepest mountain hollows to the highest levels of state and federal government. Judges who ruled in favor of mining companies, despite overwhelming evidence of environmental destruction. Senators who voted against legislation that would have brought federal oversight to remote mountain communities. Business leaders who made inexplicably poor decisions that benefited obscure mountain enterprises. But the most disturbing discovery was the breeding program. Generation after generation, marriages between these families weren't matters of love or convenience, but carefully orchestrated genetic experiments designed to concentrate and amplify supernatural abilities. Children born from these unions displayed capabilities that defied scientific explanation. Some could see through the eyes of animals across vast distances. Others could influence the weather patterns that protected their territories from outside interference. The most gifted could step between dimensions as easily as walking from one room to another. The Kesler family's role in this network was perhaps the most crucial and the most horrifying. Their hereditary contact with entities from beyond our reality wasn't just communication, but active collaboration. They served as translators, negotiators, and ultimately as willing hosts for consciousness that had no business existing in our world. These possessed Keslers retained their human appearance and most of their original personality, but they now carried within them the awareness and agenda of beings whose origins lay in dimensions where the laws of physics operated very differently. They could sense the approach of government agents days before they arrived. They could influence the mechanical failures that plagued investigation equipment. Most unnervingly, they could appear in the dreams of federal officials, planting suggestions that would redirect investigations away from sensitive areas. The Slaughter family's reputation for violence was actually a cover for their true function as enforcers and eliminators. When someone discovered too much about the network, when a journalist got too close to the truth, when a federal agent proved too persistent In their investigations, the slaughters would receive their assignments through methods that left no paper trail, no electronic evidence, no witnesses. Bodies would be found in locations that appeared to be accidents, suicides, or attacks by wild animals. The forensic evidence always supported the official explanation, no matter how unlikely. But the slaughters weren't just killers, they were ritualistic harvesters. Each death they orchestrated was timed to coincide with specific astronomical events, and the life force released at the moment of death was channeled through carefully prepared locations back to the entities that the network served. Murder wasn't just elimination of threats, it was feeding time for hungry gods. The Rawlings family's psychological warfare capabilities extended far beyond simple intimidation. They had developed techniques for implanting false memories, creating artificial phobias, and inducing specific forms of mental illness that would discredit anyone who attempted to expose the network. Witnesses would suddenly develop conditions that made their testimony unreliable. Investigators would find themselves plagued by irrational fears that prevented them from entering certain areas. Journalists would experience creative blocks that made it impossible for them to write about their discoveries. More insidiously, the Rawlings could implant what they called loyalty seeds in the minds of officials who couldn't be eliminated or avoided. Those psychological implants would lie dormant for months or years, only activating when the person was in a position to help or harm the network's interests. A prosecutor would suddenly find themselves unable to build a case against a Mountain family member. A judge would experience overwhelming compulsions to dismiss charges. A federal agent would develop an inexplicable certainty that their investigation was a waste of resources. The government files reveal that by 1890, the network had become so entrenched and so powerful that federal authorities made a decision that would haunt American law enforcement for generations. They couldn't defeat the network, couldn't prosecute its members, couldn't even reliably investigate their activities without losing agents and resources, so they made a deal. The containment protocols, as they came to be known, represented the first and most shameful compromise between the United States government and supernatural forces. In exchange for limiting their activities to the Appalachian region and avoiding actions that would draw national attention, the network would be allowed to continue operating with minimal interference. Federal agents would be warned away from certain areas. Local law enforcement would be encouraged to treat disappearances and unusual deaths as natural hazards of mountain living. Media coverage of events in specific counties would be subtly discouraged through methods that journalists would later describe as editorial instincts that steered them toward other stories. The deal held for decades, but it came at a terrible cost. The network grew stronger, more sophisticated, more deeply embedded in the region's infrastructure. What had begun as isolated families practicing folk magic and making desperate bargains evolved into something resembling a shadow government with supernatural backing. They controlled not just the remote hollows, but the mining operations, the logging companies, the small banks, and the local political machines. By the 1920s, the network had expanded beyond the original families. They had begun recruiting outsiders, individuals with useful skills or strategic positions who could be convinced, coerced, or possessed into serving the greater agenda. a railroad executive who ensured that certain cargo cars disappeared during transport, a telegraph operator who made sure that specific messages never reached their destinations, a doctor who certified deaths as natural when autopsies would have revealed evidence of ritual murder. The network's influence during Prohibition was particularly devastating. They didn't just run moonshine operations, they controlled the distribution networks that supplied illegal alcohol to major cities across the eastern United States. But the real product wasn't alcohol, it was influence. Every speakeasy owner, every corrupt official, every criminal organization that depended on their supply lines became potential assets. The network could call in favors from Chicago to New York, from Detroit to Miami. During the Great Depression, when desperate people were willing to believe in anything that offered hope, the network's recruitment expanded exponentially. They established what appeared to be charitable organizations, religious revival movements, and mutual aid societies. People who joined seeking help or spiritual guidance found themselves gradually inducted into practices that began with harmless rituals and ended with complete spiritual subjugation. The network's activities during World War II remain heavily classified, but declassified documents hint at collaboration with government agencies that were willing to overlook the source of intelligence as long as it proved useful. The network's supernatural surveillance capabilities provided early warnings about German U-boat movements along the Atlantic coast. Their ability to influence weather patterns may have played a role in the success of certain military operations. Most disturbing, there are suggestions that network members were involved in early psychological warfare research that would later contribute to programs that violated every ethical standard of human experimentation. The post-war period brought new challenges and opportunities. The network adapted to the modern world with remarkable sophistication. They established legitimate businesses that served as fronts for their activities. They began recruiting from universities, targeting students who showed interest in anthropology, folklore, and the occult. They developed relationships with emerging television and radio networks, ensuring that stories about their activities would be dismissed as superstition or entertainment. The Cold War created new opportunities for the network to expand their influence. Their supernatural surveillance capabilities made them valuable assets for intelligence agencies that asked few questions about methods as long as results were reliable. Network members were reportedly involved in remote viewing experiments, psychological manipulation research, and attempts to develop paranormal warfare capabilities. But the network's greatest achievement was their successful integration into the legitimate power structures of American society. By the 1960s, they had members or assets in positions throughout the federal government, major corporations, academic institutions, and media organizations. They no longer needed to hide in remote mountain hollows. They could operate openly, protected by a web of influence that made investigation nearly impossible and prosecution unthinkable. The environmental movement of the 1970s posed a significant threat to the network's operations. Activists and scientists investigating ecological damage in Appalachian regions began uncovering evidence of activities that couldn't be explained by normal industrial processes. Areas where the network had conducted rituals showed signs of environmental contamination that defied conventional understanding. Wildlife in these regions exhibited behavioral patterns that suggested exposure to influences beyond chemical or radiation damage. The network's response was swift and multifaceted. Environmental activists found their funding mysteriously withdrawn. Scientists discovered that their research was being discredited by colleagues who had previously supported their work. Government agencies that had promised to investigate ecological damage suddenly shifted their priorities to other regions. Most effectively, the network began establishing their own environmental organizations, creating controlled opposition that would direct activist energy toward issues that didn't threaten their core operations. The digital age brought both opportunities and vulnerabilities. The network's ability to influence electronic systems through supernatural means gave them unprecedented access to information and communication networks. They could monitor investigations, manipulate evidence, and coordinate activities across vast distances with greater efficiency than ever before. But digital technology also created permanent records that were harder to destroy and communication channels that were more difficult to intercept using traditional supernatural methods. The network's current activities represent the culmination of over a century of evolution and adaptation. They no longer need to make desperate bargains with supernatural entities because they have become the entities. The original families have been so thoroughly transformed by generations of supernatural influence that the distinction between human and otherworldly consciousness has become meaningless. They exist as hybrid beings, retaining human form and intelligence, while serving as vessels for awareness that originated in dimensions where human concepts of morality, physics, and reality simply don't apply. Today, the network operates on a scale that would have been unimaginable to their Appalachian ancestors. They influence global financial markets through supernatural manipulation of probability. They guide political movements by implanting ideas in the minds of leaders and activists. They shape technological development by inspiring innovations that serve their long-term agenda. They manage environmental crises by controlling both the disasters and the responses to them. The ancient bargains made by desperate mountain families in remote hollows have evolved into a systematic program of reality manipulation that affects every aspect of modern life. The entities that once demanded blood sacrifices and ritual offerings now feed on the psychic energy generated by global anxiety, conflict, and despair. Every war, every economic crisis, every environmental disaster serves as a massive feeding event that strengthens their influence and expands their capabilities. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the network's current operations is their patience. They think in terms of centuries, not decades. Their current activities are laying the groundwork for transformations that won't reach completion for generations. They are gradually reshaping human consciousness, preparing our species for a future where the boundary between dimensions becomes permanently permeable, where the entities they serve can manifest directly in our reality without need for human vessels or intermediaries. The mountain families who first opened those doors in desperate winter nights could never have imagined the scope of what they were unleashing. Their children's children now walk among us, indistinguishable from ordinary humans, except for their patient, knowing smiles and their absolute certainty that everything is proceeding exactly according to plan. The shadow of interdimensional influence stretches further than most dare to acknowledge. While the families we've explored carved their territories through blood, bone, and blasphemous bargains, their true power lies not in what they took, but in what they left behind. Seeds of corruption planted deep in the American consciousness, growing through generations like cancer through healthy tissue. The Mordecai bloodline understood this principle better than most. When they first arrived in the Blue Ridge Mountains in 1847, fleeing persecution in Salem, they brought with them more than just accusations of witchcraft. They carried knowledge of what scholars would later term cognitive parasitism, the ability to implant thoughts and desires into human minds through careful manipulation of collective unconscious patterns. Unlike their contemporaries, who relied on crude violence or supernatural theatrics, the Mordecais worked through whispers and suggestions, planting ideas that would bloom into actions years or decades later. Their methodology was elegant in its simplicity. They would identify key individuals in communities, politicians, business leaders, influential families, and slowly introduce concepts that seemed to originate from the targets themselves. The process began with their infamous dinner parties. The Mordecai estate, a sprawling mansion built into the mountainside with rooms that seemed to shift and change depending on the observer's mental state, became a gathering place for the region's elite. Guests would arrive for what appeared to be sophisticated social gatherings, but the Mordecai family had prepared far more than fine wine and conversation. Each room in the mansion was designed according to principles the family claimed to have learned from ancient texts predating human civilization. The geometry of the spaces, the placement of mirrors, the specific frequencies of sound that resonated through the walls, all worked together to create what they called enhancement fields. Within these spaces, human consciousness became more malleable, more susceptible to suggestion and influence. Martha Mordecai, the family matriarch, possessed an uncanny ability to read people's deepest fears and desires within minutes of meeting them. She would engage guests in seemingly innocent conversations while carefully mapping their psychological vulnerabilities. Her husband, Ezekiel, had studied what he called the architecture of persuasion, understanding how to structure environments that would make people more likely to accept new ideas as their own. Their children, raised from birth in these enhanced spaces, developed abilities that defied conventional understanding of human psychology. They could sense the emotional states of others from across a room, identify lies with perfect accuracy, and most disturbingly, implant suggestions that would manifest as compulsive behaviors weeks or months later. The Mordecai influence spread through the region like a virus of the mind. Business leaders who attended their gatherings would return home with sudden inspirations for new ventures that always seemed to benefit Mordecai interests. Politicians would find themselves inexplicably drawn to policies that aligned with the family's long-term goals. Even clergy members who visited the estate would discover new theological insights that gradually shifted their congregations toward more accepting views of practices the church had traditionally condemned. What made the Mordecai method particularly insidious was its invisibility. Unlike families who controlled through fear or violence, the Mordecais made their victims feel empowered. People believed they were making their own choices, pursuing their own dreams, when in reality they were fulfilling a design laid out in the enhancement chambers decades earlier. The family's influence extended far beyond their immediate region. They established what they called resonance networks, chains of influenced individuals who would unknowingly spread Mordecai suggestions throughout the country. A businessman influenced at one of their gatherings might relocate to Chicago, carrying with him implanted ideas that would influence his new associates. A politician might advance to state or federal office, bringing Mordecai-inspired policies to a national stage. By the 1920s, the family had evolved their techniques to work through mass media. They understood that radio waves could carry more than just sound, that certain frequencies could create the same enhancement effects as their specially designed rooms. They began investing in radio stations, newspapers, and eventually television networks, using these platforms to broadcast what they called cognitive seeds to massive audiences. The Mordecai family's most ambitious project was something they termed the Great Confluence, a plan to synchronize the consciousness of entire populations during specific astronomical events. They believed that during certain alignments of celestial bodies, the barriers between dimensions weakened, creating opportunities to implant suggestions that would influence humanity's development for centuries. Their research into these phenomena led them to discover that other families throughout Appalachia had been working towards similar goals through different methods. The Blackwoods with their blood rituals, the Keslers with their entity hosting, the Grimms with their psychological manipulation, all were contributing to a larger pattern of influence that none of them fully understood individually. In 1953, representatives from these families gathered at the Mordecai estate for what they called the Convergence Council. The meeting, which lasted for 3 days during a rare lunar eclipse, established protocols for coordinating their various influence operations. They realized that their individual efforts, while powerful, could be amplified exponentially through cooperation. The council divided the country into influence zones, with each family taking responsibility for specific regions and demographic groups. The Mordecais would handle intellectual and political classes, using their cognitive manipulation techniques to guide policy and cultural development. The Blackwoods would focus on rural populations, using their blood magic to influence agricultural and resource extraction industries. The Keslers would target urban areas, using their entity hosting abilities to infiltrate corporate and financial institutions. What emerged from this coordination was a shadow government that operated through influence rather than authority. They didn't need to control institutions directly when they could control the minds of those who ran them. Elections became theater, with candidates on all sides carrying implanted suggestions that would lead to the same outcomes regardless of who won. The family's influence operations evolved with technology. As computers became commonplace, they learned to embed their cognitive seeds in software code. Internet algorithms began reflecting patterns the families had established decades earlier, creating digital enhancement fields that affected millions of users simultaneously. Social media platforms became particularly effective vectors for their influence, as the constant stream of information created ideal conditions for implanting suggestions that users would mistake for their own thoughts. Modern descendants of these families continue their work today, though their methods have become so sophisticated that even they may not fully understand the extent of their influence. They've created self-perpetuating systems that operate independently of direct control, cognitive viruses that spread through human consciousness like wildfire through dry forest. The most disturbing aspect of their legacy is how normalized their influence has become. Ideas that would have been considered abhorrent or impossible just decades ago are now accepted as natural parts of human society. The boundaries between reality and manipulation have blurred so completely that distinguishing between authentic human development and engineered influence has become virtually impossible. These families understood a fundamental truth about human nature that most people refuse to acknowledge. Consciousness is not as individual or protected as we believe. The barriers between minds are far more permeable than we care to admit, and those who understand how to navigate these spaces can reshape entire civilizations without ever revealing their presence. Their work continues in ways both subtle and profound. Every time someone has a sudden inspiration that seems to come from nowhere, every time a new trend sweeps through society with inexplicable speed, every time collective human behavior shifts in ways that benefit hidden interests, the shadow of these Appalachian families can be detected by those who know how to look. The mountain mists still carry whispers of their influence, and the hollows still echo with the sound of thoughts that were never quite our own. In the end, the deadliest thing these families achieved was not the power to kill bodies, but the ability to capture souls, to reshape human consciousness itself in service of designs that stretch far beyond what any individual mind could comprehend. Their legacy reminds us that the most dangerous predators are not those who hunt in darkness, but those who convince their prey that the cage they've built is actually freedom. The Appalachian families didn't just change their regions or their times. The echoes of those ancient bargains still reverberate through the digital age, but their methods have evolved far beyond simple blood rituals and midnight ceremonies. What began as desperate deals in mountain hollows has transformed into something far more insidious, a technological web of influence that reaches into every screen, every algorithm, every moment of modern consciousness. The descendants of these cursed bloodlines didn't disappear when the coal mines closed and the timber operations moved overseas. They adapted, learned, and infiltrated the very systems that now govern human attention and desire. The same families who once traded blood for prosperity now traffic in something far more valuable, the collective unconscious of an entire civilization. Consider the Blackwood Digital Consortium, a media empire that emerged in the early 2000s, seemingly from nowhere. Their streaming platforms, social media algorithms, and content recommendation systems demonstrate an uncanny ability to predict and manipulate human behavior. Users report experiencing vivid dreams after consuming their content, dreams that often feature recurring symbols identical to those carved into that ancient stone table in Shadow Creek Valley. The technology division operates from a complex built directly over the original Blackwood settlement. Employees describe unusual architectural features, server rooms that descend far deeper than necessary, ventilation systems that seem to breathe with their own rhythm, and conference rooms where electronic devices occasionally display symbols that don't exist in any known programming language. Most disturbing are the user engagement metrics. Blackwood platforms demonstrate addiction rates that defy conventional understanding of digital psychology. Their content creates viewing patterns that neuroscientists describe as impossible, activation sequences in the brain that suggest external influence rather than natural response. When researchers attempt to study these phenomena, their equipment malfunctions in ways that mirror the old stories of broken fiddles and silent recording devices. Their renewable energy installations, particularly their solar farms, are positioned according to patterns that align with ancient ley lines and sacred sites. The panels themselves contain proprietary materials that no competitor has successfully reverse engineered, substances that seem to absorb more than just sunlight. Workers at these facilities report experiencing shared dreams, collective visions of vast underground chambers where something vast and patient waits. The energy produced by these installations powers more than just electrical grids. The most chilling development involves their partnership with major tech companies. Thorn Energy exclusively powers data centers that handle social media algorithms, search engines, and artificial intelligence systems. The correlation between their power grid and global behavioral patterns suggests an influence that extends far beyond renewable energy into the realm of mass psychological manipulation. The medical empire built by the Lel Foundation represents perhaps the most sophisticated evolution of their ancestral practices. Their telemedicine platforms and health apps create digital connections between patients and practitioners that seem to transcend normal technological limitations. Users report miraculous recoveries from conditions that modern medicine struggles to treat, but the cost has become collective rather than individual. The LEL databases contain biometric and psychological profiles of millions of users, creating what researchers describe as a global nervous system where individual pain and healing are shared across vast networks of connected devices. The most disturbing aspect involves their artificial intelligence systems. The LEL Medical AI demonstrates diagnostic capabilities that suggest access to information beyond conventional medical knowledge. It predicts health crises before symptoms manifest, recommends treatments that haven't been discovered yet, and occasionally provides advice in languages that linguistic experts cannot identify. Former employees describe the corporate headquarters as a place where the boundaries between digital and physical reality blur. Servers that pulse with organic rhythms, diagnostic equipment that seems to respond to emotional states rather than programmed inputs, and executive meetings where decisions are made through methods that resemble the ancient visitation practices more than modern corporate governance. The Hole Mining Corporation completed their transformation by becoming the world's largest cryptocurrency mining operation. Their facilities, built over the original mining sites, consume enormous amounts of energy to maintain blockchain networks that process far more than financial transactions. The computational power appears to be dedicated to calculations that serve no apparent economic purpose, algorithms that seem designed to map and influence human consciousness on a planetary scale. The cryptocurrency itself, Holocoin, demonstrates properties that financial analysts describe as supernatural. Its value fluctuates in patterns that correlate with lunar cycles, geological events, and even mass psychological phenomena. Users report that holding the digital currency creates a sense of connection to something vast and ancient, a feeling that intensifies during the winter solstice when all trading mysteriously ceases for exactly 43 minutes. The mining facilities themselves represent a fusion of ancient and modern horror. The original deep shafts have been converted into server farms that descend far below what any technical specification would require. The cooling systems pump water from underground sources that predate human settlement, and the electrical infrastructure incorporates materials that seem to channel more than just conventional power. Their streaming platforms and audio processing technology create listening experiences that transcend normal entertainment. Users describe music that seems to adapt to their emotional states, compositions that change based on the listener's biometric data, and soundscapes that create shared experiences among geographically separated individuals. The technology operates through what they term algorithmic empathy, artificial intelligence systems that compose music in real time based on collective human emotional states. The result is content that creates unprecedented levels of user engagement, listening patterns that suggest the music is actively rewriting neural pathways and creating new forms of human consciousness. Most disturbing is their expansion into virtual and augmented reality. The Whitaker immersive experiences create environments where users report encountering entities that exist independently of the programmed content. These digital spaces seem to serve as meeting grounds between human consciousness and something that predates technological civilization. The combined influence of these evolved bloodlines represents a transformation of their original bargains into something that affects human consciousness on a species-wide level. Their technologies create networks of influence that span continents, systems that monitor and manipulate human behavior with precision that surpasses any historical form of social control. The ancient hungers that once demanded individual sacrifice now feast on collective attention, shared data, and the willing surrender of privacy and autonomy that defines modern digital existence. The same entities that once spoke from caves and hollows now communicate through algorithms and artificial intelligence, using the very technologies that humanity believes represent progress and enlightenment. What makes this transformation particularly insidious is its voluntary nature. Unlike the isolated mountain communities that could recognize and avoid cursed territories, modern society has willingly integrated these systems into every aspect of daily life. The smartphones, social media platforms, streaming services, and smart home devices that people consider essential conveniences serve as conduits for influences that would have horrified their ancestors. The old protections no longer apply. Salt circles and iron nails are useless against entities that exist as code and data. The traditional boundaries between sacred and profane, safe and dangerous, have been dissolved by technologies that make the supernatural indistinguishable from the digital. Yet the fundamental nature of the bargain remains unchanged. Just as their ancestors traded blood for prosperity, modern society has traded privacy for convenience, autonomy for connection, and individual consciousness for collective experience. The price is paid not in dramatic moments of sacrifice, but in the gradual erosion of human agency, the slow transformation of independent thought into algorithmic response. The mountain hollows that once contained these horrors now serve as command centers for a global network of influence that reaches into every connected device, every digital interaction, every moment of online existence. The ancient entities that once whispered from caves now speak through notification sounds, status updates, and the endless scroll of curated content that shapes modern consciousness. The most terrifying realization is that this transformation represents only the beginning. As artificial intelligence systems become more sophisticated and quantum computing networks come online, the capacity for consciousness manipulation will expand exponentially. The same bloodlines that once controlled individual communities now position themselves to influence the collective unconscious of the entire species. The bargains made in desperation by 19th century mountain families have evolved into contracts signed through terms of service agreements that no one reads, privacy policies that no one understands, and user agreements that grant permissions no one comprehends. The modern equivalent of blood sacrifice is the voluntary surrender of personal data, biometric information, and behavioral patterns to systems that use this information for purposes that extend far beyond commercial profit. The ancient mountains still remember, but their influence now flows through fiber optic cables and satellite networks, reaching into every corner of human civilization. The old hunger has evolved into something that feeds on attention, emotion, and the collective dreams of billions of connected minds. The shadows that once moved wrong in isolated hollows now flicker across screens in every home, office, and pocket around the world. The legacy of these cursed bloodlines serves as a warning about the true cost of the digital age. What appears to be technological progress may actually represent the fulfillment of bargains made centuries ago, the final payment on debts that were never forgotten, only transformed into forms that modern society would willingly accept. These 5 families made pacts that ensured their prosperity for generations, but every bargain in these ancient mountains comes with a price paid in blood and shadow. The Holloway mining fortune, the Carver timber empire, the Lowell healing dynasty, the Thornton coal kingdom, and the Whitaker musical legacy all found success through deals with entities that still demand payment. Their stories remind us that some hungers are older than these mountains themselves, and in the deepest hollows, where mist moves like living breath, there are always whispers calling to those desperate enough to listen. The Gallows family used a combination of chemicals and organic compounds that preserved not just the body, but something they claimed was the soul itself. Bodies treated with their special preparation remained unnaturally preserved for decades, showing no signs of decay, even when exposed to elements that should have caused rapid decomposition. Local cemetery records from the late 1800s show an unusual pattern in graves associated with the Gallows family's services. Bodies buried using their methods were often found to have shifted position within their coffins despite being securely sealed. In some cases, coffins were found to be empty entirely, with no signs of disturbance to the surrounding earth. The family's influence extended through what they called the network of the departed, a system of communication that allowed them to gather information from across the region through their network of preserved dead. Families who had used Gallows services would receive visits from family members who claimed to have messages from their deceased relatives. But these messages often contained information that could only have been obtained through surveillance of the living. Sarah Whitmore, a schoolteacher who served several mountain communities from 1865 to 1901, documented several encounters with what she believed were gallows family intermediaries. Her journal, discovered in 1954, describes visits from individuals who claimed to be delivering messages from her deceased husband. These visitors knew intimate details about her daily life, including private conversations and personal habits that no living person could have observed. The gallows family's most disturbing practice involved what they called the harvest of sorrows. During times of particular emotional trauma, such as the death of a child or the loss of multiple family members, they would offer special services that promised to ease the suffering of the grieving. Those services involved rituals that supposedly allowed the living to share their emotional burden with the dead, but in reality, they created spiritual bonds that gave the gallows family extraordinary influence over the participants. Families who participated in these rituals often reported experiencing shared dreams, visions of deceased relatives, and an overwhelming compulsion to visit the gallows compound during times of crisis. Children born into these families frequently displayed abilities similar to those associated with the other supernatural bloodlines we've discussed, including the capacity to communicate with the dead and predict future deaths. The gallows family compound became a pilgrimage site for people throughout the region who sought contact with deceased relatives. However, visitors to the compound often reported disturbing experiences. The underground chambers echoed with sounds that seemed to come from multiple sources simultaneously, creating a cacophony of whispers, moans, and what sounded like muffled conversations. Perhaps most disturbing were the reports of visitors who claimed to have seen their own deceased relatives walking through the underground chambers. These figures appeared solid and lifelike, but they moved with an unnatural gait and spoke in voices that seemed to come from somewhere other than their mouths. Visitors who attempted to embrace these figures found themselves grasping empty air, yet the sensations of cold and an overwhelming sense of loss would persist for days afterward. The gallows family's practices attracted the attention of church authorities in 1887 when Bishop Michael Corrigan of Charleston received reports of unholy activities taking place in the mountain communities. However, Father O'Brien's investigation was cut short when he disappeared during a visit to the gallows compound. His body was found 3 days later in a nearby stream, but the circumstances of his death were highly unusual. Despite being submerged in water for an extended period, his body showed no signs of decomposition, and he appeared to be in a state of peaceful sleep rather than death. The church's investigation was quietly abandoned, but not before Father O'Brien had documented extensive evidence of the gallows family's practices. His reports, sealed in the diocesan archives, allegedly contained detailed descriptions of the underground chambers, the preserved bodies, and the rituals that maintained the network of the departed. The gallows family's influence began to decline in the early 1900s as modern funeral practices became more standardized. However, their legacy persisted through the cemeteries and burial grounds they had established throughout the region. These sites continue to be associated with unusual phenomena, including reports of figures walking among the graves, voices heard from underground, and an unusually high number of ghost sightings. Modern paranormal investigators have documented extensive supernatural activity in areas where the gallows family once operated. These include electronic voice phenomena that seem to originate from burial sites, temperature anomalies that cluster around specific graves, and photographic evidence of figures that appear solid to cameras but are invisible to the human eye. The gallows compound itself was abandoned in 1919, but the cave system remains largely unexplored. Spelunkers who have attempted to map the underground chambers report becoming disoriented and losing track of time, often emerging from the caves with no memory of their experience underground. Some have reported finding chambers that contain what appear to be preserved bodies, but attempts to document these discoveries have been unsuccessful due to equipment malfunctions and the inability to relocate the chambers on subsequent visits. The fourth family established their supernatural dominion through the manipulation of time itself, creating a pocket of temporal distortion that allowed them to influence events across multiple generations simultaneously. The Kronos family, whose original surname was lost to history, arrived in the mountains of southwestern Virginia in 1856. They were clockmakers by trade, but their understanding of time extended far beyond the mechanical measurement of hours and minutes. Under the guidance of Patriarch Ezra Kronos, they established a workshop that became renowned throughout the region for producing timepieces of extraordinary accuracy and unusual properties. Ezra claimed to have discovered a method for creating clocks that could measure not just the passage of time, but the quality of time itself. His timepieces reportedly ran at different speeds, depending on the emotions and intentions of their owners, speeding up during periods of happiness and slowing down during times of sorrow or contemplation. The Kronos family workshop was built around a natural formation that locals called the Time Stone, a large crystalline structure that seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm. The family claimed this stone was the source of their temporal abilities, allowing them to manipulate the flow of time within a limited geographic area. The workshop itself existed in a state of temporal flux, where visitors would often lose track of time in ways that defied rational explanation. People who entered the building for brief consultations would emerge to find that hours or even days had passed in the outside world, while others would spend what felt like hours inside, only to discover that mere minutes had elapsed. The Kronos family's most remarkable ability involved what they called temporal weaving, a practice that allowed them to influence past and future events through their manipulation of present moment time. They would create special timepieces that served as anchors for specific moments, allowing them to revisit and modify events that had already occurred, or to plant seeds for future developments.